What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting video, and today we're going to be going over the magicka Templar and which race is going to be the most effective for a magicka Templar. Been seeing online across Reddit and on the forums some questions. This is actually a fairly common question as to what race should you choose for your magicka DPS. The common two answers are either Altmer, the High Elves, or Dunmer, the Dark Elves. And there are a couple of reasons why people are kind of torn between the two of them. So back in Homestead, before Morrowind launched, a lot of magicka DPS were using Fire Blockade on their back bar. So the Maelstrom Inferno Staff instead of the Maelstrom Lightning Staff that you see now. With that introduction of a lightning staff, a lot of people were also using the destruction staff ulti on the back bar. So you had the blockade of fire along with the fiery rage. So that obviously meant you're doing a lot of fire damage. So Dunmer were a natural choice for pretty much every class except for Sorks, because Sorks, their class abilities mostly dealt shock damage, so an Altmer was the natural choice for a sorcerer. But now that the off-balance meta has come in due to the changes that they made in Morrowind, now a lot of magicka Templars, magicka Nightblades, they're starting to use Thunderous Rage and Blockade of Storms instead of Blockade of Fire and Fiery Rage. So the question now is, does the addition of those two sources of shock damage, as well as the shock damage enchant on the front bar that's now the preferred enchant, does that push Altmer ahead of Dunmer for these two classes? So that's what we're going to try to find out today. So the thing with Templars, besides, obviously, we have Blockade of Storms and Thunderous Rage, as well as shock damage as our three sources of shock damage. But we also are, if you're using a ranged Magplar, you have Crushing Shock, which you have some extra shock damage there. And your racial passives do impact how much damage each of those three hits do for Crushing Shock, so keep that in mind. But you also have Vampire's Bane on a Magplar, which gives you two sources, or I guess an additional source of fire damage. So for a Magplar, you really have three sources of fire damage. You have Vampire's Bane or Reflective Light, you have Force Pulse or Crushing Shock, and you have your light attack from your front bar. And you have four sources of shock damage. You have Blockade, you have Thunderous Rage, you have the shock damage enchant on your front bar, and you have Force Pulse or Crushing Shock. So where does that all fit in? So just as a reminder, Dark Elves have a 9% increase to max magicka. So if we go look over at the Altmer have a 10% extra magicka, so it's a 1% difference. Altmer also have 9% extra regen, which is actually not insignificant. It's actually a fairly good passive to have, extra regen, especially on a Templar where you have sustained problems, particularly if you're using Crushing Shock or Force Pulse. While we're on this page here, Altmer have 4% increase to Flame, Frost, and Shock damage, and if you compare that to the Dunmer, Dunmer have 7% increase to Flame damage, but only 2% to Frost and Shock. So this last passive here, Elemental Talent for Altmer and Destructive Ancestry for Dunmer, that's kind of where things kind of come into question here. Does the 3% extra Flame damage that you get from a Dunmer offset that 2% loss in Frost and Shock damage? And for Altmer, does this kind of the reverse for Altmer? Does the 2% loss in gain, I should say, in Frost and Shock damage offset the 3% loss in Flame damage? So that's what we're going to try to find out today. So we're just going to be doing two parses here, one with the Dunmer, one with an Altmer. Everything else is going to remain exactly the same. The only thing we're going to be changing is going to be our race. So Mundus Stone, our rotation, our gear, that's all going to stay exactly the same. Now our disclaimer, like any other parse video that I've done in either theory crafting or builds, this is only one data point for each race, so we're not really going to be able to make any definitive conclusions. We're going to need to collect a lot more data points in order to create an average so we can truly see whether there is a significant difference or not. But at least with this parse we can kind of get a sense of where things stand between Altmer and Dunmer. We can start trying to pinpoint areas where that can we can use to kind of infer which race is going to be better. So without further ado, let's get started with our parses. Alright, so that is our parse for the Dunmer, roughly 35k. Gonna have to save this fight so we can compare it when we do our race change right now. So we're just gonna race change to an Altmer and keep everything else the same. Race change token, keep our appearance the same, and log back in. Now, if you guys haven't done a race change before, one thing to keep in mind is that when you do a race change, all your racial passives are reset, so you get your skill points refunded and everything is cleared, so you're going to have to put points back into your racial passives when you do a race change. Just a piece of information in case you guys didn't know that already. We're just going to have to add in points for our passives. And we're gonna have to build up ultimate again. Okay, use purifying light to get a little bit of extra ultimate going on. So one thing to keep in mind too is that I am using a ranged Templar build, so I am using Crushing Shock instead of sweeps as my spammable. So with sweeps this might change how things work out because then we lose a source of fire and shock damage, but from what I've seen it doesn't really seem like melee Magplars are really that great anymore, at least due to the bug with sweeps, so that's something to keep in mind. Alright, here we go. This is the Altmer parse now. Alright, so there we go. That is our Altmer parse. Take a look at common metrics. 35k, pretty much on the dot here. So let's go ahead and take a look. So here, this one is the Dunmer parse. We can see the difference is pretty small. It's only, if I do my math right, it's only 33 DPS difference between the two of them. So let's go ahead and explore why this might be the case here. So what we're going to be looking for is going to be sources of fire damage and sources of shock damage. So this is our Altmer parse. So this is looking at Altmer. So we have Thunderous Rage, Blockade of Storms, that's 20.7. Light attacks make up 7%, so that's 27.7. Charged weapon is 4.6, so we have 27.7. In the 4.6 from charged weapons, and we have 3.9 from crushing shock. That gives us 36.2. Heavy attack and Lambris make up 2.3% each, so let's see, 36.2 plus 4.6. It's 40.8. And concussion, and this is kind of small, so we can just kind of, I guess we can add in concussion because it's greater than 1%, so that's 41.9. So 41.9% of our damage came from sources of shock damage. So let's do the same thing now, except this time for fire damage. So we have our light attack, which is 9.6%. We have Vampire's Bane, which is 3.9. Vampire's Bane, which is 3.9%. We have Crushing Shock, which is 3.7%. Burning is a straight 3%. Lambris is 2%, and Vampire's Bane, the initial hit, is 1.4%. So that gives us 23.6% of our damage comes from fire damage, at least on an Altmer. So now if we swap over to our Dunmer, we should see more or less the same numbers. So we have just shock damage, 10.2, 9.6, 6.2, 5.1. Crushing shocks down here, 3.7 and 3. The heavy attack, Lambris makes up 2.6. We'll add in those last two down there, the concussion, and so that's 42.7 came from shock on our Dunmer. And for our fire, we have 10.6, 3.9, 3.8, 2.9, 1.8, and 1.6. And that gives us 24.6% of our DPS came from fire damage, as in Dunmer. So we can see here clearly a lot more of our DPS is coming from shock damage compared to fire damage, regardless if we are a Dunmer or an Altmer. So the disparity is fairly large. It's almost a 20% difference in terms of percentage DPS. So that is a fairly large difference. So just based on that, even though these two parses are more or less identical to each other, Altmer theoretically does have a higher DPS output than Dunmer, at least on a Magplar that's using Crushing Shock. Obviously, if we swap over to the melee build with sweeps, that might change. But you can see here the difference is pretty small. It's not really anything that is going to make or break a raid team. So ultimately, it really doesn't really matter which one that you end up choosing. A 37% difference, 37 difference in DPS. That's minuscule. That's basically nothing. You can pretty much call them the exact same thing. So at least for a Magplar, it seems like while Altmer theoretically have a higher damage ceiling, doesn't really matter which one you choose. We can choose to be a High Elf or a Dark Elf, and you will still be able to pull roughly the same DPS. So that's it for this video. Hope you found it informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.